The institution of nuns and sisters who devote themselves in various religious orders to the practice of a life of perfection dates back to the early days of Christianity. A nun is a woman who vows to dedicate her life to religious service and contemplation, living under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience in the enclosure of a monastery or convent. St. Paul speaks of widows who were called to certain kinds of church work, and of virgins whom he praises for their continence and their devotion to the things of the Lord. From the earliest times, they were called the spouses of Christ. Women who were not interested in marriage or raising kids joined religious convents. In the Catholic Church, the order of nuns began in the 6th century, with St. Benedict being the first to establish the Benedictine order, which focused on manual labor and prayer. St. Vincent de Paul founded the Daughters of Charity, which provided medical care to the poor, and other orders such as the Carmelites, Franciscans, Dominicans, and Cistercians were established in the following centuries. In the Catholic tradition, there are many religious institutes of nuns and sisters, each with its own special character. Traditionally, nuns are members of enclosed religious orders and take solemn religious vows, while sisters do not live in the papal enclosure and formerly took vows called simple vows. This is the distinction between nuns and sisters. In the early centuries, there were no special places arranged for religious women who sought an ascetic life. Virgins who vowed to the service of God continued to live with their families. However, by the end of the 3rd century, there were community houses where they lived together. By the beginning of the same century, virgins formed a special class in the church, receiving Holy Communion before the laity. They were mentioned in certain church rituals such as the Good Friday office and the Litany of the Saints. They were sometimes admitted among deaconesses for the baptism of adult women and to exercise the functions which St. Paul had reserved for widows of 60 years. When the persecutions of the 3rd century drove many into the desert, the solitary life produced many heroines, and when the monks began to live in monasteries, there were also communities of women. During the early Christian period, particularly in the 3rd and 4th centuries, there was a significant development of monasticism, including the establishment of convents for religious women.
St. Pachomius is
credited with building one of the earliest convents where women lived in community under religious vows alongside his sister. St. Jerome, a prominent figure in Christian history, gained renown for the monastery he established in Bethlehem, which was led by St. Paula, a wealthy Roman woman who is a renowned Christian ascetic, disciple of St. Jerome. St. Augustine, another influential theologian, provided guidance to nuns through a letter which later formed the basis for a rule of life for religious women. Across various regions such as Rome, Italy, Gaul, Spain, and the Western world, monasteries for women flourished, adapting rules established by prominent religious figures. However, practices within these convents varied, with some like the nuns of Egypt and Syria adapting customs such as cutting their hair, which differed from practices in the West. This diversity in practices reflects the dynamic and evolving nature of early Christian monasticism. Monasteries of women were generally situated at a distance from those of men.
St. Pachomius
and St. Benedict insisted on their separation. In early times, the nuns gave Christian education to orphans, young girls brought by their parents, and especially girls intending to embrace the religious life. Non-enclosure laws. Over time, the rules and practices within nun orders evolved, with early orders typically being less strict compared to later developments. In medieval Christianity, particularly during the 13th century, there were various forms of consecrated religious life for women. One aspect was the taking off the veil, a symbolic act marking a woman's commitment to religious life, often accompanied by taking vows of simple profession, which involved vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. However, there was also more solemn consecration of virginity occurring at the age of 25. As centuries passed, the mendicant orders emerged, characterized by a stricter adherence to poverty, which extended to communal possessions as well. Mendicant orders are Roman Catholic orders that combine monastic life with outside religious activities. The word mendicant comes from the Latin word mendicare, which means to beg. Mendicant orders reject the traditional monastic model, which involves living in an isolated community, working at a trade, and owning a property in common. Instead, mendicant orders have male members, live in poverty, travel and live in urban areas to preach, evangelize, and minister to the poor. They depend on their listeners for survival. St. Francis of Assisi, known for his dedication to poverty and simplicity, guided St. Clare in founding the Second Order of Franciscans in 1212. Similarly, St. Dominic established a constitution for nuns before founding friars preachers, approved in 1216. From the time of the mendicant orders, there was a great difference between the orders of men and women, arising to a strict enclosure to which women were subjected. This rigorous enclosure, usually in the East, was also imposed on all nuns in the West, first by bishops and particular councils, and afterwards by the Holy See. Boniface VIII, by his constitution Periculoso. In the text he states, wishing to provide for the dangerous and abominable situation of certain nuns, who, casting off the reins of respectability and impudently abandoning nunnish modesty and the natural bashfulness of their gender, we do firmly decree that nuns collectively and individually, both at present and in future, of whatsoever community or order, in whatever part of the world they may be, not henceforth to remain perpetually cloistered in their monasteries, so that the nuns be able to serve God more freely, wholly separated from the public and worldly gaze, occasions of lasciviousness having been removed, may most diligently safeguard their hearts and bodies in complete chastity. This constitution was inserted in canon law and was made an inviolable law for all professed nuns, and the Council of Trent confirmed this constitution. Hence it was impossible for religious women to undertake works of charity incompatible with the enclosure. So the education of young girls alone was permitted to them, and that under somewhat inconvenient conditions. It was also impossible for them to organize like the mendicant orders, because the mendicant orders such as the Franciscans and the Dominicans have a structure where a superior general oversees multiple monasteries, and members are connected to a larger province rather than just one specific monastery. However, in this case, they couldn't adopt this system. Each monastery operated independently without a central authority governing several houses, and members were strictly tied to their own individual monastery. The difficulty was sometimes avoided by having tertiary sisters, who are bound only by simple vows, and are dispensed from the enclosure. While nuns couldn't go out and preach like the friars, they still followed the spiritual teachings and ideals of their respective orders within the confines of their convents. As monastics, nuns living within an enclosure historically commit to recitation of the full divine office throughout the day in church, praying and singing beautiful hymns, usually in a solemn manner. These nuns are called choir nuns, staying mostly inside the main area of the monastery, focusing on their prayers. But there are also other nuns called lay sisters, who help with practical things like cooking, cleaning, and running errands outside the monastery. This last task is still often entrusted to women called externs, who live in the monastery but outside the enclosure. They were usually either oblates or members of the associated Third Order. The Third Order consists of lay persons who follow the spiritual guidelines of religious order, like the Franciscans or Dominicans, without taking monastic vows, living in a religious community, often wearing a different habit or the standard women's attire of the period. Externs might go outside the monastery to buy groceries or do other tasks that need interaction with the outside world. Depending on the monastery's rules, externs might dress like the choir nuns or just wear regular clothes. This helps everyone understand who does what in the monastery. In 1566, Pope St. Pius V took significant steps through his decree Circa Pastoralis on May 25th. He not only enforced earlier rules from Pope Boniface VIII and the Council of Trent, but also required members of third orders, that is tertiaries, to take solemn vows and live under strict monastic enclosure. For almost 300 years, the Holy See, the central authority of the Catholic Church, did not approve any convents where members only took simple vows. Moreover, in 1631, Pope Urban VIII issued a decree called Pastoralis, which dissolved a English-teaching congregation started by Mary Ward in 1609 because it had simple vows and a superior general. Because of the strict rules around religious life, new groups called secular associations were formed. These groups did not require permanent vows and focused on living together to help their own spiritual growth and to do charitable work. One example is the Daughters of Charity, founded by St. Vincent de Paul. Despite the strict rules set by Pope St. Pius V, which required communities to follow stringent guidelines, not all communities followed them strictly. Some communities were approved by local bishops and tolerated by the Holy See. New communities emerged with local bishop approval because they provided valuable services to the poor, sick, youth, and missions. Although the Holy See confirmed the rules for some of these groups, it often did not formally approve the group themselves, adding a note that this approval did not officially recognize the congregation. Due to political challenges, especially for women, it became harder to maintain the strict solemn vows. As a result, from the late 18th century, the Holy See stopped approving new congregations with solemn vows and even abolished solemn vows in women's orders in places like Belgium and France. In 1900, Leo VIII's decree on Dite established common laws for congregations with simple vows, dividing them into two main categories: those under diocesan authority, that is supervised by local bishops, or sisters who are only bound by simple vows, and congregations with simple vows often focus on active ministries like education, healthcare, and social services. These congregations can be under either diocesan or pontifical authority, depending on their foundation and scope of work, and those under pontifical law, that is, directly supervised by the Vatican. These orders are generally under pontifical authority. Now that we have talked about the origin of nuns and sisters, let's see the current picture of them. In 19th century, the shift from primarily solemn vows to allowing simple vows more broadly in the Catholic Church began with the reforms of Pope Leo VIII. From the time, simple vows became popular and widespread everywhere because of its flexibility. But nonetheless, nuns do still exist. Now let's understand the different aspects between nuns and sisters. Do you remember in the beginning I stated the difference between religious nuns and sisters? Let's understand it in a bit more detail. The terms nun and sister are often used interchangeably. However, within Roman Catholicism, there is a difference. A Catholic nun is a woman who lives as a contemplative life in a monastery, which is usually cloistered or semi-cloistered. Her ministry and prayer life is centered within and around the monastery for the good of the world. She professes the perpetual solemn vows, living a life according to the evangelical counsels of poverty, celibacy, and obedience. Whereas a Catholic sister is a woman who lives, ministers, and prays within the world. A sister's life is often called active or apostolic because she is engaged in the works of mercy and other ministries that take the gospel to others where they are. She professes perpetual simple vows, living a life according to the evangelical counsels of poverty, celibacy, and obedience. Because both nuns and sisters belong to the church life form of religious life, they can also be called women religious. As you might have noticed, there is a difference in the type of vows, solemn versus simple. The new commentary on the Code of Canon Law explained the distinction this way. The older religious orders, such as monastic, canon regulars, mendicants, and Jesuits, have perpetual solemn vows, and the more recent apostolic congregations have perpetual simple vows. The chief juridical difference between the two is that religious who profess a solemn vow of poverty renounce ownership of all their temporal goods, whereas religious who profess a simple vow of poverty have a right to retain ownership of their patrimony, such as an estate, endowment, or anything inherited from one's parents or ancestors, but might give up its use and any revenue. In ordinary conversation, the terms nun and sister are used interchangeably. Both nuns and sisters are addressed as sister. When a woman enters a religious order or monastery, she first undergoes a period of testing called postulancy. lasting 6 months to 2 years. If she and the order believe she has a vocation, she receives a modified habit and begins the novitiate, a period of 1 to 2 years living the taking vows. After this, she may take initial temporary vows lasting 1 to 6 years, which must be renewed for at least 3 years and no more than 6. Finally, she can petition to make her perpetual profession with permanent vows. In Benedictine traditions, nun takes vows of stability, that is, remaining in one community, and obedience and conversion of life, including poverty and celibacy. In other traditions, such as the Poor Clares and Dominican nuns, they take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, known as the evangelical counsels. Most other orders follow one of these patterns, sometimes adding a vow specific to their mission, like a particular devotion or prayer intention. A nun elected to lead her religious house is called an abbess. If it is an abbey, prioress. If it is a monastery, or more generally, Mother Superior and Reverend Mother. Both nuns and sisters play invaluable roles within the Catholic Church, each embracing their unique callings with dedication and devotion. Nuns living in contemplative communities commit themselves to a life of prayer, silence, and solitude, offering spiritual support through their hidden lives of devotion. Sisters, active in the world, engage in various ministries, bringing the love and compassion of Christ through education, healthcare, and social justice. Together, nuns and sisters embody the diverse expressions of religious life, enriching the Church and the world through their contemplatory vocations, united in their commitment to faith and service.